Let me presume to introduce Wales, this surprisingly diverse, rocky, sea-bound peninsula in northwestern Europe. Green mountains sweep down to craggy coastlines. Cow-dotted fields and ancient moss-covered Atlantic oakwoods cling to the slopes. Limestone, sandstone and dark-bellied granite vie to outcrop. Fast-flowing streams tumble and trickle through the moss and the peat. Rivers race down the inclines, gathering tributaries and challenging salmon and suin to keep jumping. Deep coastal weirs open into rich, shallow waters. Regular rains water the ground, even as the tropical waters of the Gulf Stream keep the climate mild and temperate. That was a quote from the book Welsh Food Stories by my guest today, Carwyn Graves. Imagine the food of this land, Wales. Women using the produce that landscape created, oats, leeks, cheese, cockles, lamb and butter, to create meal after meal of nourishing, sustainable food. This is the food of Wales, and in today's episode I'm talking to its chronicler. We talk about food born from landscape, sustainability, women as the holders of ancestral heritage, fermentation, bread, and much, much more. Welcome to the Ancestral Kitchen Podcast with Alison, a European town dweller in central Italy, and Andrea, living on a newly created family farm in northwest Washington State, USA. Pull up a chair at the table and join us as we talk about eating, cooking, and living with ancient ancestral food wisdom in a modern world kitchen. Welcome back. Today I am very grateful and excited to be sitting with, or at least virtually sitting with, Carwyn Graves, the author of Welsh Food Stories. Hi Carwyn, and thank you for coming on to the Ancestral Kitchen Podcast.
Hello, good afternoon. Really good to be here.
So the first question we ask all our guests is, what is the last thing you ate? And I know, because you're close to me geographically, that you've just had lunch. So what was that?
Yeah, that's right. We had what we usually have for lunch, which is salad from the garden. We're lucky here in West Wales that we can grow salad year round. Salad from the garden with some, I'm glad to say today, homemade sourdough bread, which just simple and delicious.
Are you the baker?
Yes, I am, yeah.
Okay, and how do you like making sourdough?
It's become, this is the honest answer, it was, a learning curve a few years ago, and it was really exciting. And now it's just a really humdrum part of the routine that I enjoy, in the sense that you enjoy, like, taking in a blue sky or something. It's like, and that's a good thing for me, which is it works, and I take pleasure in that, but I don't give it almost any thought.
Yeah, I think that's a good thing because, bread making is a staple and always was. And so feeling like it's part of the landscape and yet pleasurable, like looking at a blue sky, those are both positive things in my book.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I didn't expect to, when I was, reading up everything and trying out different recipes and, learning, I never expected to get to this sort of place. But I take a certain pleasure in the fact that I realised a few months ago, this is my relationship with it now, and that's fine. It's good.
Yeah, excellent. So I've just finished reading your book, Welsh Food Stories. I have to say most of it I read out loud. My husband and I have an 8-year-old boy. We read together in the evenings and we share books. So I read some 8-year-old books and he gets to listen to some adult books. And all three of us totally enjoyed it.
That's really nice.
Yeah. So I wanted to say congratulations, because it is not only such an informative book, but it's so beautiful. And it's full of traditional foodways of Wales, which is often an unnoticed country. So thank you for writing it.
No, it was a privilege to be able to write. And I said the wrong thing at one of the book launches, and I said, I wish I'd never had to write this book. But what I meant by that it would have been so good if somebody else had done it years ago, when some of the traditions that I write about, which are still alive, but are weaker now than they were, 20 or 30 years ago. But yeah, it's a privilege to have been able to meet people, keeping traditions alive, and others bringing things back too. So yeah, it has been a privilege to be part of that journey.
I felt that reading the book, that you're describing traditions that would have been alive like 50 years ago, probably still, and the sense of what it would have been like to have been in all of those kitchens 50 years ago, witnessing that, and that just would have been wonderful. Yeah, so I get that sense. So I'm from the UK, so I know Wales quite well, but a large portion of our listeners are in the USA and around the world, and some of them won't know anything about Wales at all. So tell us where and what Wales is.
Where Wales is quite easy. So we are a peninsula on the island of Great Britain, and the easiest way to locate Wales is to think halfway between England and Ireland. We're in the middle between England and Ireland. England one way, Ireland the other. And that's actually, I like that description, halfway between England and Ireland, because there's a lot about Wales that is also in some ways halfway between England and Ireland. Half of what is true of England is true of Wales, and half of what's true of Ireland is true of Wales. And we've got a few other bits kind of thrown in as well. So what Wales is, well, that's you could, I think, meaningfully talk about Wales as an ancient Celtic culture. Some people are skeptical about those terms, but there's something in that that is true. It is part of the UK. There is an independence movement here. It has also so my first language is not English. You may or may not be able to hear that, but my first language is Welsh. It's my kids' first language as well. We live in a part of Wales where Welsh is still the main community language, at least in the countryside. And that is a language that has been spoken here since well before records began. So the language comes with with a culture that I could spend the next 3 hours boring you about, but I won't. That gives you a sense, at least, and listeners as well.
You wouldn't bore me, but we don't have 3 hours, unfortunately. So your kids speak Welsh at home with yourself and your wife, yeah?
Yeah, so I realised about 2 months ago that my son, who's 3, that I could now start telling people that they can talk to him in English. As in, his English is about 9 months behind his Welsh, and that's quite common, for Welsh speakers. We all pick up English, even if home and friends and social life and school are all in Welsh. There's just so much English about in other ways and media and so on that everybody does, unless you have learning difficulties or people with dementia. They often then will, not speak English, but most Welsh speakers are fluent in English.
Okay. That makes sense. I feel I'm really interested when you talk personally, because my granddad was Welsh, but moved out of Wales when he was a boy with his mum and dad to go to just over the border in Chester into England for work, and then never went back. But the language itself to me is completely alien to English. It's so different that I struggle even with the terms of the food in your book. Each chapter of your book is based on a food, and trying to pronounce them. I'm going to leave that a bit to you, I think.
If you want a good Englishman's take on the Welsh language, then I'd highly recommend something that Tolkien wrote, J.R.R. Tolkien, that people can get hold of, which is an essay on English and Welsh, where he calls Welsh I think he uses the term the elder sister of these islands. And he writes as a proud Englishman, but he writes very appreciatively and understandingly about the two languages and their relationship. And it's a really interesting essay if people are interested.
Wow, thanks for that. Thanks. I wanted to talk about the landscape as well. You describe the landscape in the book beautifully. I mean, literally, some of the descriptions of the landscape made me well up, brought tears to my eyes. Can you try to explain to our listeners about the Welsh landscape?
Yeah, there's so much has been said about the Welsh landscape. I mean, we're not talking about a massive area. Out of curiosity, I recently actually looked up the size of the state of Vermont in the USA, which is one of the smallest of the states, to compare it with Wales, and it's actually bigger than Wales.
Wow.
But without slating in any way Vermont and all that it has, in its favour. I think it's probably fair to say that we have a lot more diversity or variety in our small area here than most comparable sized areas of the world. And that's because of so many things to do with geology and climate and so on. But we have high mountains that are actually only 1,000 meters tall. But when you stand, I used to live in the Alps, and actually in the Alps, because the valley bottoms are already at like 1,000 meters above sea level, and then the peaks maybe 2,000 meters.
I see.
It's comparable, not everywhere, but in lots of places. So because of the wind and everything, you've got mountains that feel, at least in winter, as though they're alpine, and then you've got areas on the coast that actually are among the sunniest parts of Northern Europe, which people, Wales is famous for its rainfall, and the mountains really are very rainy. But the coast, you've got very sunny areas with very mild climates, frost-free year-round, some of the very mildest parts. So that already gives you a sense of, and then you've got, obviously wide open moorlands, you've got, wooded valleys, which are actually, the native kind of what's the term? Ecotone, eco-space, is rainforest. It's native temperate rainforest. So not a tropical rainforest, of course, but we do have seasons. But the differences in some of these places between winter and summer are not massive, and that gives everything a texture, I suppose. So we've got and the underlying geology as well. You've got everything from kind of white limestone cliffs to dark ancient volcanic stone, red sandstone, everything again in this small area, and species. It's interesting. I'm writing another book now actually on the landscape, and the history of the Welsh landscape, and when it comes to native plant species, Wales is about a third the size of the island of Ireland, but we have several hundred more native plant species.
Gosh.
And almost as many as England. And England is, again, several times bigger.
Yeah.
And it's because we cram a lot of different sorts of, geologies and landscapes and climates into this small area. So we've got a bit of everything. As far as
That's what comes across. That's what comes across in the book, the variety, completely different geographies and therefore completely different foods, really. We talk a lot on the podcast about really to be sustainable and to eat in a way that supports the world. It's the land around us that should determine our food choices. And it feels to me like the foods that you write about in your book have absolutely been determined by the landscape in Wales, and that's created this kind of unique food history. Can you speak a little bit to that, explain to our listeners how the geography and the climate and that variety has built the cuisine of Wales?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's geography and climate, and then of course the third ingredient is people and what people do with that, and that knowledge of place. I mean, some examples there. So I wrote a book previously, Apples of Wales, which tells the story of apples and orcharding and cider making and all this kind of thing in Wales. And nobody had ever written about that. One person had done a booklet about cider making in Wales, and that was it. And you actually got in print people making statements like, Wales has never grown much fruit as the soil and climate are not suitable. And that's wrong, as a statement. But here's where this all comes in, because actually the truth of the matter is that we have mountains down the middle of the country, and on the western half of the country, in the western half, where summers are cooler and wetter and winters are milder and wetter, apples were grown in sort of farm orchards and back gardens in towns and this kind of thing. But they were never made into cider. So apples were part of something that you ate, and particularly cooked to eat. But they were never made into cider. Whereas east of the watershed, where summers are just that bit warmer and drier, and it just allows a good crop really of apples. cider was so important, as in the conditions were just, that much different that cider became so important in the rural economy that from about the 17th century onwards, we don't know exactly, but around then, so hundreds of years ago, um, cider became the mainstay in kind of agricultural labour's wages. People were paid in cider. Um,
Wow.
and then around that, of course, grows a whole host of traditions. We have a thing called love spoons in Wales, which is something you give to your lover, and people carve that out of apple wood because of the kind of symbolism of the apple tree and the sweet, the sweet connotations and all this kind of thing, and nursery rhymes and just a whole range of different things. So, but none of that kind of none of that cider culture, to be specific, none of that cider culture attained west of the watershed. So that's a watershed climate thing. Another one would be grains. So people might know that traditionally, there are a wide range of grains grown across Europe. So you're talking about rye and wheat and oats and barley and so on. But generally, as the last few hundred years have moved on, the variety in any given area has decreased. So you had wide swathes of Eastern Europe basically depending on rye and not much else. You had places like northern France growing wheat and the other things falling to the wayside, the other grains. Same thing happened in England. So in England, some of the traditional varieties, the local land races of wheat, were really out of cultivation by the 1850s. Now, some of the Welsh traditional varieties of wheat were still being cultivated, and we have reliable reports of this as late as the 1950s and 60s. But they were grown in some areas, whereas other areas, only a few miles away, where you might be 100 meters higher up, which wouldn't matter much if you're in Italy, but in Wales it makes a massive difference to the climate and the soil and so on. They might not have ever grown wheat and only ever grown barley and rye. So this diversity meant actually that over small, quite small distances, a big diversity of grains that actually in this case represents most of Europe, because we had oats, barley, wheat and rye to not quite within living memory. Rye died out first in Wales, but we had them all in different areas quite late on. So yeah, that shows it as well. I could go down the list of foods. You could talk about the sea and seafood, and a big range of those as well, and which ones. We could talk about all of them. And I think this is the thing, is we are talking here about a peasant cuisine, and that both explains why you have this diversity, because you didn't have, even though Wales was a key part of the British Empire, you didn't have really many people in Wales taking much part, I don't want to over-exaggerate this, but much part in the global food economy until the 20th century. And that led to the continuation of this peasant cuisine, as I say, to well within living memory. There's a lot of people that I meet in the countryside in their 60s and up, so really not that old. And we're talking in 2023, and that's what they still grew up with. People, some of them, they had maybe flour bought in and tea and sugar, and pretty much everything else was locally sourced.
Yeah, wow. So why do you think that Welsh food really is relatively unknown compared to other European nations? I think, for example, of oats, Welsh widespread use of oats, but everyone associates oats with Scotland. I mean, why isn't Welsh food more well known?
Couple of things. One is Wales generally, and its culture and everything to do with that is less well known than even take Ireland and Scotland, which geographically they're bigger, population wise pretty comparable. We're 3 million, Ireland's about 4 and a bit million, and so on. So and they're much better known. Well, why? Well, they there was mass emigration from those countries, but in Wales we only had a little emigration. And we actually had a lot more immigration because of the industry here, because of coal mining and steel making and these things that really built the country, slate quarrying. You had immigration. So we have a heritage here of of coffee shops run by Italians that go back to the
Okay.
1890s in working class communities across Wales. So that is part of the story. But another part of the story is, like I mentioned, this peasant cuisine. If you think about a context where you've got a whole load of people living in the countryside until the latter part of the 20th century, very much living in their very localized area, and still to a certain extent, varying from person to person, eating quite a localized, what you could call peasant diet. And then you put that in the same country as you've got very, very early industrialization. What you have is a context where if you want to make money, it's quite easy to make it. Either if you've got capital and you want to invest to make more money, or if you're a worker and you want to just, actually earn decent wages, you can do it in industry. And there's no shortage of work in that sense. And that means that there's not much of an incentive to try and monetize food, peasant cuisine in lots of rural France, rural Italy. There's not much else that you can do other than major on your foods, but you don't have that incentive in Wales. Now there's more to it than that, and nobody's actually done any proper kind of academic research into this. But from my reading over the last 5+ years into this, I think that's a major part of the story. And what I will just add to that is, it's not because the quality of the food isn't there. There is a stereotype about British food, sometimes about English food in particular, but sometimes about British food in general, that it's not good, that it's boring, that it's bland, and so on. But that is quite a recent stereotype. And if you go back for the Victorian era and any time before then, that's not what you find, actually. And actually there's there's a lot of contemporary records. You don't get any feeling from contemporary descriptions, newspaper reports, travellers to Wales from the continent, and so on, that there's anything lacking in the food, or that the people are undernourished or malnourished. You do get those reports in Scotland, and of course in Ireland you have the potato famine.
Yeah.
There really isn't any evidence for that in Wales. So it's not because of anything to do with the quality of the food. It's probably more to do with the fact that there's not much incentive to do anything with it other than eat it.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, the quotes that you put in the book from travellers who were travelling 100, 200, 300 years ago in Wales are just wonderful. The types of foods they ate and what they ate, there certainly was nothing lacking in the foods or the hospitality, for sure. So I'd agree with you there. Are you looking for a powerful source of nutrients to enhance your overall health and well-being? Look no further than beef organ capsules from One Earth Health, where the cattle graze on lush New Zealand pastures. The beef organs are sourced from 100% pasture-raised cattle, ensuring that you receive the highest quality and most nutrient-dense organ meat available. Beef organs are some of the most nutrient-dense foods you can find, with high levels of vitamins A, K, and the B complex. Customers report more energy, improved skin health, and a strengthened immune system, thanks to the powerful nutrients found in these organs. For a limited time, One Earth Health is offering Ancestral Kitchen Podcast listeners a 5% discount on all orders and free shipping. Each bottle has 200 capsules and comes in cheaper than other New Zealand-based organ supplements. Take advantage of this amazing deal and experience the benefits of beef organs for yourself. Order now and enjoy the incredible health benefits of One Earth Health's beef organs made with care and quality in New Zealand. Visit oneearthhealth.com/ancestral kitchen. The link is in the show notes. And let's talk about oats a little bit, because oats weave their way through every part of the book. And I thought in particular our listeners would love to hear about how they were used as bread. And, when I say bread, I don't necessarily mean the bread that you and I were talking about earlier on, your sourdough that you're making. I'm talking about flatbread, so oat cakes on a bake stone on the stove. Tell us a little bit about oats in Wales.
Yeah. I mean, if there was a single grain, I mentioned the diversity, but within that, if there was a single grain that was, the cornerstone, the staff of life, as some people would say, in Wales, traditionally, then it would be oats. And again, I don't want to overuse the past tense here. I met an old lady, she just retired from farming. She's in her 80s. But she was telling me just in the last summer, she was telling me about her brother in the hills near where I'm living, and she said, "Oh yeah, until COVID, until 2019, he sowed oats. Yeah, they were something that he'd got from his father, and then and I keep hearing these stories. So it's not that these things are completely dead or gone. It's that they've gone under the radar a bit. So oats, when we had the fullness of oat culture, absolutely, oats were grown everywhere. Particularly, they do well, or better than any other grain, in quite poor growing conditions, where it's windy and where it's wet and where it doesn't get that warm in summer. That's why, of course, they were very widely grown as well in Scotland. And what one of the main things that people made with them was what we would call bara kirch. Bara is bread, so that's why you said bread earlier. Bara kirch. So the literal translation would be oat bread. But what this is it's not like in the UK in a supermarket you can buy an oat cake, and that's like a little biscuit. Like again, biscuit means something different in America, but that would be small, something like the size of the palm of your hand or something. No, what I'm talking about is something that maybe 30 centimeters in diameter, sort of size, rolled out very thin, and then, as you say, baked on a bake stone, and then people would make I say people, I should say women. And they would make a big batch at once, and then every house would have a kind of drying rack implement. Of course, it's got its own name, and it was made out of I think it was which type of wood was it? I do know, and I can't remember, so I'm not going to say the wrong thing. But it was made out of a particular type of wood, and there was a reason for that. And that they were stored, and that was your supply for the week, and then that was even further processed. So when they got really stale, so firstly, I should say, people would then eat on them. So you can kind of imagine a sort of open sandwich type thing on this 30 centimeter diameter little plate of oats cake, and the range of things. I mean, it could be quite simple things like spread butter over it, cheese, but also things. One of my favourites is something called cocos a wia. Now, this is a Welsh dish that has died out completely, sadly, but it was made until the early 20th century. And probably mid 20th century, and it's cockles that are fried with onions and a bit of salt and pepper and eggs. Fry the whole thing together, and then serve that between two slices of this oat bread or oat, big oat cake. And if people can source the ingredients and try it at home, it's delicious, because what you have is the kind of the slightly sour seafoody flavor cutting through from the cockles, a little bit of sweetness from the onion, of course, and then the savory dryness of the oat, and of course what you fried is just got that moisture, and it just works. And so that's one example, again, among many of things that you'd use the oat bread for. So and then, of course, as I mentioned, they could be processed further. So people would then, when they got older, you had too many or whatever, they'd then crush them and steep that in buttermilk, so traditional buttermilk, bioactive buttermilk, and then make a dish out of that. And and that's just one. That's just bara kirch. Then there's a whole range of other oat dishes as well. But I think it's fair to say that you don't get a sense that people looked at a chest of oatmeal, which is what people had, and thought, "Oh, I can't make anything much with this. I guess it's got to be porridge." It's not that.
Yeah, that's what I mean. I've been researching oats for a couple of years now. Just started off because I love oats, and I'm just astounded by what people of Great Britain did with oats, because it's not just about porridge. Everyone just thinks oats porridge, but the Welsh examples of what was done and what is still done with oats are tasty and really inspiring too.
Yeah. And oats, let's be so oats are amazing. They fill you. They have a very, they're naturally gluten free, to put it simply. They the glycemic index is great. They're a fantastic ingredient. They do well in organic cultivation. So no pesticides use and everything, so better for the for insect life and everything. So oats are amazing. They don't, because they don't have gluten. Wheat. It does something to us, and
Yeah.
who know more about the science can say more about that than I can. But you just put some bread into your mouth, wheat bread, and it just triggers something on a chemical level inside it. Because oats don't have that, you have to work a little bit harder with them. But what you end up with are, in my opinion, quite subtle but satisfying flavors and dishes. And particularly, I think the other thing that's worth saying here is that I've got nothing against modern variety of oats, and they've been bred to be productive, and there's a lot of good work that's happened there. But in Wales, again, still in cultivation, and more people are trying to bring them back. We had at least 14 named, widely known native oat varieties, some of which almost certainly go back to the kind of Iron Age, pre-Roman, which is just astounding. That kind of continuity of cultivation. And they've got all their names. They're all Welsh: Caerdy Bach, Caerllwyd, Caercwta, and they're all different. And so, just to give an example from the Caerdy Bach, that's the little black oat, literally translated. That really is black, and when you make oatmeal out of it, when you process it, mill it, and everything, you get oatmeal. It's very dark, and you try and make an oat cake or oat bread, in the Welsh way, out of that, or something more porridge-like, or other things. It's got a much nuttier flavour, a very full flavour for oats. And so I think that's also part of the story here, is it's not one type of oat. Again, I could wax lyrical about apples and the variety of flavours within apples. And I think that's something that we moderns, and people who are used to a kind of modern Western way of eating, lose sight of, is an apple is not just an apple, and an oat is not just an oat. And for our ancestors, they were used to a greater variety within this smaller range of species, if you like, but there was more variety within that.
Yeah, I'm really excited about getting my hands on some of those black oats. I've been following the Patrick Holden's farm, and the fact that they're growing black oats, and I'm like, all right, I want to get some of those and try those. I want to pick up on something else you said, which was, because there's no gluten, you have to work a little bit harder. And I mean, I've been playing with oat cakes here and trying to roll them out and making sure they're not breaking and trying to get a nice edge so it's not all kind of bobbly. It's hard.
Do you know that in some parts of Wales, sorry to interrupt, but some parts of Wales,
no, go.
Farm workers, female farm workers, they were hired by virtue of their reputation as to how well they made oat bread or oat cake.
So I'm trying to channel that energy. So I'm going to be the perfect oat cake maker. Let's talk about women a little bit more, because you say in the book quite a lot that the holders of these food traditions in Wales are women, and most of our listeners are women, and it's something quite close to our heart. Women are the one who made the cheese. The cockles that you talked about were collected by women. Women made the breads. Women used the bake stone.
Yeah.
And you kind of implied in the book that's played an important role in the rapid loss of the foods and traditions since industrialisation. And when I thought about that, I wanted to ask you, do you see other nations where more traditions have survived as simply having a greater predominance of male-held traditions? Or maybe that traditions in other nations have been masculinised in order to ensure their survival where they weren't and haven't been in Wales? What's your take on that?
Yeah, it's definitely a complex picture, but I think I'd say two things. Firstly, I'd say um, yes, uh, that this really, I don't think you can do justice to this whole story about Welsh food without putting women front and center. Um, and at the same time, I think as a Welsh speaker and as part of this culture, I think I have to acknowledge, and as a man as well, that I have to acknowledge that I think the way that we have defined our own culture in Wales, we've defined. I think this is quite interesting. We have defined it, culture as basically things that men did in their free time,
Mm.
and that has led to the exclusion of within a traditional society kind of setup, to the exclusion of activities that women took part in. Now, a thought that may come to some listeners' mind as well, that's probably because women didn't have any free time.
Mm.
It's certainly true that women worked incredibly hard. There's no question about that. But also, it's clear that actually there was, a good deal of free time in winter. Again, until early 20th century, there was very common social institutions, Noson Lawen, which is a sort of basically social get together, and people would have fun and do all sorts of things, both sexes. But there, you'd have the men kind of going off to do poetry, and that
Mm.
poetry is a very high place in Welsh society, and that's very true now. It's not dying in any sense whatsoever, um, but it's been a male thing, and that's only now changing. And women would go off and they do all sorts of things around singing, but also around knitting and so on. But we
Mm.
haven't, in our Welsh culture, we haven't given knitting and all the beautiful things that rose out of that, quilts and all sorts of things, any place either. We haven't given them any status. So I think part of it is an internal thing about the dynamics of Welsh culture, and how we have to come to terms with that ourselves. Um, the other thing you asked was about the comparison, and obviously
Mm.
there are things here that are part of a broader kind of maybe European or Western dynamic, and I think it is interesting to compare with other nations. And I speak French, and I've lived in France, and I think it is really interesting to think about the food tradition of France and this question about women, and because France has generally fought really hard to retain and it's given food that place in its culture. Um, so how do we understand this? And I think it is interesting there to look at how you've got chefs rising up from quite an early date in France. This kind of culture around the chef, and the chef
Mm.
is a male. That's a male domain. In the courts of first the kings and so on, and also then when restaurants get developed in Paris. But then what you get is women, particularly of course in the city of Lyon, in south central France. You get women stepping into this male domain, and they get called mère, mother. You've got les mères lyonnaises. People can look it up. The
Mhm.
Lyonnais mothers, um, and and there's a massive, centuries long then tradition of these female chefs, um, and feminism is not my field per se, but from what I understand of studies in this, you could understand that as this remains a kind of male domain and male space in France, kind of food, um,
Mm.
but we create a kind of enclave within that for women, and we give it a title and we call them mothers, and so they remain women within a male space, but we really make that very clear by calling them mothers. So that, I think it's interesting to understand that as a counterpoint, because I think in Wales as well you could make a comparison with England, and I think I'm not
Mm.
saying anything controversial to say that English food culture, it's got tradition and heritage and fantastic dishes and all these sorts of things I've been saying about Wales. They're also true in different ways about England and different parts of England. Um, but um, uh, but the general view, and certainly within England itself, is very low. And you've got the same I think you've got the same thing happening there as you've got in Wales, and you've got, there's no sense in which what women do in the kitchen receives any status or any acknowledgement in England. And yeah, I mean, history is not science, so but it is interesting to make these comparisons. So for me, that comparison with other European societies and cultures and their own dynamics kind of confirms this idea about whether a culture acknowledges women and their role with food or not, and that having a massive effect on the overall attitude to food. Let alone, of course, the question of the overall attitude to women, which is a whole other story.
Yeah, it's incredible. We have listeners from all over the world, and I'm here in Italy, but I'm English, grown up in England, and I see, the traditions that Italy are famous for, the charcuterie. It's very male dominated because it's kind of butchery. It's been a male field, and the pizza. All the pizza restaurants. I've never seen a woman as pizzaiolo, making pizzas. But then you look at that lady who came in like 10 years ago and filmed all the pasta grannies, and there's that idea of these women who were the heads of the household, looking after, managing the household, and they're now grannies, and they can still make, 3,000 pasta shapes in 2 minutes without even looking, and there's this kind of dynamic of what's been exported from Italy is artisanal traditions, which are male, and yet someone has come in and tried to nurture the kind of female side and let that be shown as well. And all over the world, from listeners I hear, people who've gone from Italy to America and have kind of grandparents who are Italian, and now they're kind of finding their roots, and people in all over the world who all their memories are of being with their grandmothers or being with their mothers in their kitchens, and what they made and how that was part of the local landscape, how that was with local food. And it feels, I saw that echoed in your book as I was reading. I could see that these traditions and the connection with the local geography and the local land that provided the input to the kitchen through the food was very much held by women. And I feel a loss of that kind of culture and that valuing of just wonderful health for a family and management and sustainability. It's such an important thing, and everywhere it seems is losing it.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, I don't feel that I'm going too far in positing that, you've basically got male decision makers who, because this is not their domain, and they haven't learned how to cook, and they haven't, and they see it as the woman's domain, and it's kind of taken for granted, a little bit out of sight, out of mind. It doesn't feature. It doesn't need protecting or promoting, or and so by 1,000 small decisions and comments and blah blah blah, it just slips away. Whereas maybe hypothetically, if things were different and you maybe had a mixed group of decision makers, or I don't want to have a world just ruled by women, so let's say a properly mixed, you want both, and when the voices are equal, then it would feature, it might, over the last 100 years in different societies around the world, certainly here, it doesn't feel crazy to me to imagine that the conversations would have been different, and that food would have featured in a different way, and that would have an effect on policy and on culture more widely.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Do you love oats? Want to try your hand at a traditional Scottish oat fermentation? Suhan's is just that. It was made in Scotland for centuries and will give you both a creamy, easy to digest porridge and a tangy probiotic drink. My video course, Suhan's, the Scottish Oat Ferment, over at the Fermentation School, We'll guide you through everything you need to know to create these 2 ancestral foods in your own kitchen, no matter what equipment you have. Head to ancestralkitchen.com/Sewans, ancestralkitchen.com/Sewans, SOWANS, or click the link in the show notes to get a 10% discount automatically applied. Let's move on to talk a bit about fermentation, another area that we're all passionate about. And I want to talk about buttermilk because your book, like I said earlier, is divided into chapters, and each one of those is a staple traditional food. And such a big part of Welsh food is dairy. You've got a whole chapter dedicated to cheese and a whole chapter dedicated to butter. And I did want to talk about buttermilk. Can you give us the name in Welsh for buttermilk first?
Yeah, so for me, it's Llath Enwyn. Now, in different parts of the country, there are different dialectical terms. So there may be Welsh speakers that listen to this and say, that's not the right term. Well, but that's what we call it in my area, Llath Enwyn.
Okay, thank you. And buttermilk, as you describe it in the book, is completely different to buttermilk as we might buy it in a supermarket nowadays. So can you explain about proper buttermilk?
Yeah, well, this is something that is, it's the side product of butter making and churning in that sense, made with, of course, in all of these traditional contexts, and absolutely in Wales up until commonly, that is, up until the 60s and 70s, on a lot of farms, made, at home for home use often, or for selling quite locally. And the buttermilk is the side product, but it's made with raw milk, and that means that it's it's bioactive. It's full of bacteria, and then used. Really had a really iconic central place in people's ways of eating. So this is quite a thin product. If you make cultured buttermilk, you can end up with something a bit thicker than what we're talking about here. So this is a thin product. It's sour. I heard somebody recently, when I was doing a talk near here, explain to her daughter, so she was maybe in her 60s and she grew up on this in this part of Wales, and she was explaining to her daughter, who's probably in her 30s, and she was saying, oh, it's just, imagine the taste of kefir, which you can buy in supermarkets here now. It's like kefir. It tastes like that. And if people are familiar with that, then that is quite similar. It's sour, thin, and bioactive, crucially. Fermented, and then used. So used in baking, absolutely, massively used in baking. So one of the most well-known kind of foods to come out of Wales is Welsh cakes, which are small little sweet, neither cake nor a biscuit, using those terms in the UK sense.
Yeah.
They're in the middle. They're a little bit like a scone, but not. But they're made with flour, and you put dried fruit in them, and sugar, and egg, and buttermilk. Traditionally, that is. And if you make a Welsh cake, you'll find recipes online really easily. If you find the recipes that have buttermilk, and if you don't have buttermilk, then you could put kefir in, and you basically get the same thing. Try making them without that, and then making them with, and compare the difference. And it's just enormous. And that kind of it gives baked goods a kind of tangy flavour, just fantastic. And it was liberally used in baked goods of all sorts, including, I mentioned, scones. Scones became popular in Wales. They're a good Southwest English thing. They became popular here. Breads as well, pancakes. Buttermilk was basically anything baked. People put buttermilk in.
And it sounded like from your book that they would drink it all the time too.
Yes. So it was used as a drink all the time. There's, of course, there was a lot of traditional kind of sayings and knowledge around it being health-giving.
Yeah.
And I find that fascinating, and I go and I do talks, as I alluded to earlier. I often talk to groups of older folk, and they know some of these sayings, and they know some of the kind of what they grew up with, this knowledge about buttermilk, that it was good for you and it was good for your stomach and these sorts of things. And it's encoded in sayings in Welsh, and they know that. And then I say to them, yeah, but do you know what? Kind of the science around gut health has shown in the last 10 years? Our ancestors were right. And that is a little bit, I think, fair to say, it's a little bit mind-blowing to them, because they've grown up with this idea that, that kind of industrial supermarket food is good and is what we should be eating, and that the stuff that people grew up with was backwards and old-fashioned. And this is the older generation in Wales. And so for them to be told that traditional knowledge about the health-giving benefits of like raw milk, buttermilk, traditional buttermilk, it's really interesting to see that kind of mind encounter happen.
Yeah. I just think about things. The whole generations whose biome must have been just changed, literally, because of the fermented buttermilk they were drinking every day, and the loss of that now, the last however many 50, 60, 70 years, the biome of people in Wales must be changing because they're not drinking raw buttermilk anymore.
Yeah. And so drinking raw buttermilk, and also another one that was ubiquitous was a very simple sort of summer dish of, talking about seasonality here. With all of these foods, and so an early summer, new potatoes or early potatoes, the first crop in Wales, in coastal parts, milder parts, you can plant potatoes in early March, and they can be ready by the very beginning of June. And there's always a race between the milder parts of Wales with Cornwall and that kind of thing, whose early potatoes are ready first, kind of thing. And anyway, so then an early summer dish, potatoes fresh from the ground, they taste absolutely delicious, and then just boiled up, and then served with buttermilk and sometimes a bit of parsley or that sort of thing, and a bit of salt. And it's really simple and really delicious, and it uses again the products of of this country. And again, just another thing, if I may, now milk in industrial agriculture in Wales, just like anywhere else. I mean, it's not quite as bad here because cattle that produce a lot of milk still, a lot of milk and butter is made here. They are out most of the year, and they are grazing. They're not kept in massive feedlots and stuff in Wales. So we're lucky in that sense, and that's good. But what they're grazing is generally improved grass mixes. But what they would have been grazing 50 years ago, and all through history until then, was a mixed herbal lea with a massive mix of native grasses, and also they'd have been browsing, shrubs of hawthorn and different things, and of course clovers came in, and that itself, there is some evidence that the actual balance of omega-6 to omega-3 fatty acids in milk can entirely switch over. So it's about 2/3 to 1/3 in conventional milk. But if you have milk from these mixed traditional pastures, low input pastures without fertilizers and things, then it's one, rather than 2/3 to 1/3, it's 1/3 to 2/3. So it gives it the same omega-3 to 6 ratio as seafoods, which is just astounding. That changes the nutritional profile of milk.
Gosh.
And that is, of course, what people here, everybody took entirely for granted.
Yeah, and we're not eating the same foods that we were eating 50 years ago. We're not.
We still call it milk, but chemically and nutritionally, it's not the same product.
Yeah. Okay, I want to talk about one more fermentation, which is an oat fermentation. Going to include oats and fermenting together, which is an area I'm very passionate about. And I've been making the Welsh oat fermentation. I'm going to try and pronounce it, and you can correct me. Chymru.
Yeah.
Is that right? Yeah.
Chymru.
Okay,
Chymru, yeah. Absolutely, yeah, fantastic.
It's spelled Llymru, but it's pronounced Chymru. And thank you. I'm going to practice that after we finished. I started making originally suans, which is a similar oat ferment from Scotland, and then I stumbled across this thanks to the book Welsh Fare. And I can't get hold of raw buttermilk here, so I used whey, which is raw, and I made myself. And I really love it. I love putting it in the fridge, seeing it go all like jelly and slicing it up and eating it in various different ways. And the recipes that are mentioned in your book and in that other book that I talked about, Welsh Fare, which is by a lady called Minwell Tibbet, they use buttermilk in a lot of griddle breads, like you were saying, like in the Welsh cakes, in various other breads. And I wonder, was that ever left to soak and produce a ferment like the oat ferment I've just mentioned to kind of make a sourdough bread, or was it always cooked up straight away and not left to ferment?
Yeah. So Llymru is it's fantastic, and it does create this thing, like you say, that's a bit like jelly. And there are, to mention, there are several others as well. So there's sican, and there's sican gwyn, and there's shot, and there's llif, and these are all variations of fermented dishes using oatmeal, water, and buttermilk, typically, and then other things, as they were served. And to answer the question about soaked to sourdough, I think the answer is yes, but it's almost devilishly hard to find out. And the reason for this is that from quite early on, all of these sort of sour flavors and dishes, that were made in this way, that were fermented, of course, just like actual sourdough starters itself themselves, and bread made with sourdough starters, they attained quite a low status socially, and that means, of course, in a historian's work, typically you're relying on written material of many different sorts, and things that have low status, people don't tend to write about. So we have to work out whether it was the case or not. We kind of have to read between the lines, and from reading between the lines, I think the answer is yes. But it's really frustrating that that I can't say it with more confidence than that. But let me give an example of the sort of reason why I can be quite confident. Is that you do have, and I think this one may actually be in that book that you mentioned. If people are in the UK, they can get hold of it. I don't know if it's available more broadly, but that book, Welsh Fare by Minwell Tibbet, is fantastic. And I would just advise people not to buy, it's going to sound terrible, but not to buy any other Welsh recipes if you're after kind of the traditional peasant fare as it was actually made and eaten in Wales, because what Minwell Tibbet did, and she's a woman, by the way, Minwell is a female name, same theme. She was a pioneer, actually, in women's studies in general, and she sadly died now. And she went round in the 60s and 70s, round all sorts of areas, country areas, urban areas, and she talked to the older generation alive at the time then, and got their recipes and their sort of ways of doing things. And at the time, that was a new thing to do, and really groundbreaking. And that book is just, it's whatever, 100 pages of, and it's not a recipe a page, it's like 3 or 4 recipes a page. So there's a lot of stuff in there. So I'd really recommend that if people are interested in trying some of these things out and finding out more. Welsh Fare, Fare. But yeah, in that book, I think she's actually got, if I remember, a recipe for crempog sirgyrch, and that would be a sour oat pancake. And in other places as well, in some of her other works, and some other sources as well, you come across references to sour this or sour that in connection with baked goods, and piecing that together with what we do know about what people did do, and some very very throwaway comments about bread making, very, very brief, just a sentence, a throwaway sentence here in a letter or in a recollection there. I think it did happen. And I think it's equally interesting. It's not surprising that it did happen because it makes perfect sense that people knew that it worked and did it. But I think it's equally interesting that they saw it as something that was, not shameful, but low status, something that if you had to do, you would do. But if you could get hold of, shop yeast or brewer's yeast, not that they're quite the same thing, but, barm from, beer, then it's better to use them. And you get other references, even in medieval poetry, actually, to kind of poor people's bread and described as sour, whereas wealthy people's is described as, as sweet or light or whatever.
That's interesting.
None of this is surprising, but it is interesting, isn't it? It's part of that broader picture about our relationship with fermented foods in a Western European context, at least.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you. So we're getting close to time. I have one more question for you, which is going back to the broad picture, which is what do you want your book to do? I mean, I look at countries and I live in a country that's seen its food traditions revered and then commoditized. And it's made some of the people who live here rich, and it's done wonders for tourism. But on the ground, I don't see it feeding back into the soil or the community or the wisdom. And, I can imagine you're bringing these traditions forward in your book and showing them to people. And I can't imagine you want, what's happened necessarily to Italy to be true for Wales. But what do you want to happen because of your book?
Yeah, it's interesting a bit sad to hear you say that about Italy, because in one sense I hear that my instinctive reaction is, but we're in no danger of having what happened to Italy. If only we could have that sort of what we do have in Wales is we do have, I think, for a Western and a post-industrial country, we do still have a very strong connection to the land. That's not just a niche thing that some people care about. It's quite kind of common and widespread, and that's a real strength. And we have strong working class communities that do still, some of the foods we've talked about, they're traditions that have been dying out or more or less have died. But we could have talked about, the other probably 4 chapters in the book, and we'd be talking about traditions that are very much still with us, but they're working class traditions. And so they still don't have high status. Some of the seafood things, like I refer to cockles. Cockles, you can buy them anywhere where I live. And in the fish and chip shop, they serve battered cockles and all this kind of thing. And they're local and they're sustainable, and they're still hand-picked. And that's been true for 2,000 years. And it's a fantastic story. But the people that buy them are working class people. They don't have any cachet. Okay. And we still have that for a whole load, actually. Faggots are another one. That's that means a kind of meat ball made with onions and things, and then also made with tripe, with offal bits from pigs, and that's is very popular, but particularly among working class people. It doesn't have any social status among better off people. So we've got that in Wales, and what I would love to see is for us to actually, it's nice for people in other parts of the world to take interest in our foods and our traditions. But really what I would like to see is that we ourselves actually look at what we do still have, some of these food traditions, and acknowledge what they are, and acknowledge actually the fact that we've got like common, popular, working class dishes that use offal or cockles or things like that, and just say, and they're locally sourced and on all these things, and just say it's fantastic, and let's celebrate it, and let's not fall over ourselves to say that we need to all eat Thai food or whatever it is, because I love Thai food, but if we're not going to eat the offal that we produce, then who else is going to? There's something here, there's a bigger. I hope listeners maybe understand something of this background that I'm talking about living within our means on this planet, eating sustainably in a way that actually is in tune with the patch of earth that we have been given, and that includes seasonality. It includes certain foods. I'm not saying that, and I think I said it quite clearly in the book. This isn't about preaching to my fellow Welsh women and men, saying stop eating bananas and chocolate. That's not the point at all. It is about saying right now we still have got some local food traditions that are nourishing, that are good, that provide connection to culture and to community and to the land. They're tasty, they're popular among a certain part of our culture and country, a really important part, but not, generally not kind of more educated or better off people. And maybe we should change that. Maybe there's something here that we've kind of, turned our noses up a little bit at over the last, maybe 30 years. And maybe we shouldn't. Maybe it's actually part of the answer to how we live sustainably over the coming decades lies with us and in our past. I'm hoping that the book contributes just a little bit to re-enchanting people with the potential of our own food. If we could eat 90% food that was seasonal here, produced from here, and the other 10% was the bananas and the chocolate and the coffee and the stuff that we can't possibly produce here, then then a whole load of things would be better. Without detailing all the things that could be better. Well, actually, it might well, rural employment, community cohesion, people's health, carbon emissions. There's a win-win-win-win. But there's a whole load of work to do, because that's not where we are right now in Wales. Certainly, it's not where the UK is, and it's not where most Western countries are either. But the reason, of course, that we have cheap food that we can import is because it's cheap for us because somebody else is paying. And to a great extent, that's citizens of the global south, and it's also the planet.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just messages so close to my heart that you're bringing out so eloquently. And I think, when you read the book, that's why I particularly wanted to talk to you, because it's so clear through your writing, how passionate you are about that idea of, living within our means, and that we have the wisdom available to us to still do that. So thank you very much. I can't wait to come and visit Wales. I might get back to the UK this year. I'm not sure yet. I don't get back very much.
But... Sure, you know this already, but I'll give listeners a tip as well. Do come and visit. You'll be very welcome. But don't come between November and February. It really is very wet then. Do come spring. Spring is the best time of year here, and you'll get to actually see the country at its best, and the bluebell woods and all these different things that are just fantastic.
Beautiful, and certainly read your book and Welsh Food Stories, because it will not only inform you about Wales and give you so many ideas to try in the kitchen, but really get you enthused about local food and ancestral food. It's just really wonderful. Thank you ever so much for all the work you did bringing that book to life, Carwyn.
Good. Oh, well, thank you.
If people want to go and find out more about you, where should they go?
So the book is available online. I know it is available in the US through Barnes & Noble, and I think Amazon as well, and it's available online from a range of places. And then I have a website I haven't updated for a while, but I'm going to be updating more regularly again. That's my name, Carwyn Graves, Carwyn, carwyngraves.com. As I say, there is already quite a big archive there of articles and things, quite in depth in both English and Welsh. And I will be putting more things up there over the coming months. And I have a newsletter. It's only like 3 or 4 a year, just signpost people to stuff I've written or stuff I've done. So if that's of interest as well, it's all about Welsh food and increasingly the landscape as well. So I'm going to do more connecting food with landscape, because this other book I'm finishing now is about that. There's a bit of that, as you said, in Welsh Food Stories, but I've done a bit more of the last year or two since Welsh Food Stories was written.
Wonderful. I look forward to reading it. Thank you ever so much for your time, Carwyn.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye. Thank you so much for listening. We'd love to continue the conversation. Come find us on Instagram. Andrea's at Farm and Hearth and Alison's at Ancestral_Kitchen. Until next time, we both wish you much fun, exploration and satisfaction in and out of the kitchen.